History often misleads us into believing that greatness is destiny, that men like Julius Caesar were born with a crown already hovering over their heads. But the truth is far more violent and far less certain. Before he was a colossus striding across the known world, Gaius Julius Caesar was merely a target, a boy born into a Rome that was actively trying to kill him. Born in July of 100 BC, he entered a world not of marble and philosophy, but of blood and betrayal, where the Republic was already rotting from the inside out. His childhood was stripped away at the age of 16, not by the slow passage of time, but by the sudden, crushing death of his father. In a single heartbeat, the weight of his entire lineage crashed down onto his teenage shoulders, forcing him to become the patriarch of a family that was walking a political tightrope over a pit of vipers. He was the nephew of Gaius Marius, a legendary general who had revolutionized the Roman legions and held a magnetic, almost cult-like sway over the soldiers. But in Rome, blood ties are a double-edged sword. When Marius waged a brutal civil war against the ruthless dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla, young Caesar found himself on the wrong side of history. Sulla was not a man of mercy. He was a purge master who posted lists of names in the forum, names of men to be hunted down and butchered like cattle. And there, in the shadow of his uncle's defeat, Caesar realized he was next. He refused to divorce his wife Cornelia, the daughter of his uncle's ally, an act of defiance that should have signed his death warrant. Stripped of his inheritance, hunted by the most powerful man in the world, and hiding in the mosquito-infested marshes to avoid Sulla's assassins, Caesar did the only thing a man with nothing left to lose could do. He joined the army and fled to the distant, dust-choked frontiers of Turkey, buying his life with the coin of exile. But exile did not break him, it forged him. While serving in the East, the young aristocrat discovered he had a talent for violence, earning the civic crown, a garland of oak leaves awarded only to those who saved a life of a fellow citizen in battle, a high honor that whispered of the greatness to come. When the dictator Sulla finally died in 78 BC, the tension in Rome snapped, allowing Caesar to return. But he came back to a ruined home. His family's wealth had been cannibalized by the state, leaving him with nothing but a famous name and a silver tongue. He took to the courts, becoming a relentless lawyer who used his voice like a gladius, cutting down corrupt governors and rebuilding his reputation brick by brick. Yet fate has a twisted sense of humor, and just as he began to rise, the sea decided to claim him. At 25 years old, while crossing the Aegean Sea, his vessel was swarmed by Cilician pirates, cutthroats who terrorized the Mediterranean. They dragged him onto their filth-ridden deck, expecting a terrified noble to beg for his life. But they had captured the wrong man. This chapter of his life reads like fiction, yet it is stark historical fact. When the pirates demanded 20 talents of silver for his ransom, Caesar laughed in their faces, insulted them for not knowing his value, and demanded they ask for 50. For 38 days he lived among his captors, not as a prisoner, but as a nightmare guest. He joined their games, wrote poetry which he forced them to listen to, and when they didn't laugh at his jokes, he called them illiterate barbarians to their faces. He would casually tell them to be quiet when he wanted to sleep, and in moments of dark humor, he promised them that once he was free, He would return and crucify every single one of them. The pirates roared with laughter, thinking it was the idle boasting of a soft Roman boy. They took his money, dropped him on the shore, and sailed away, counting their easy fortune. But Caesar was not a man of empty threats. He immediately raised a fleet, purely on the strength of his personality and credit, and hunted them down with terrifying efficiency. He found them, captured them, and true to his word, lined the coast with their crosses. He cut their throats first to show a flicker of mercy, but he left their bodies rotting in the sun as a message to the world. Julius Caesar keeps his promises. However, military victories and crushed pirates were not enough to silence the demons in his own mind. After the tragic death of his wife Cornelia, which severed his last link to his innocent youth, Caesar was sent to Spain to serve as a military administrator. It was a dry, desolate assignment, far from the glory of the Senate floor. One afternoon, wandering through the city of Cadiz, he stumbled upon a statue of Alexander the Great. Most men would see a monument to a hero, but Caesar saw a mirror reflecting his own failure. He collapsed at the foot of the stone conqueror, weeping uncontrollably. Alexander had subdued the entire known world by the age of 32, while Caesar, now 33, had done nothing but survive. The panic of mediocrity seized his heart, the terrifying thought that he might die a footnote in history rather than its author. That moment in the Spanish dust changed everything. The tears dried, replaced by a cold, burning ambition that would consume the Republic. He swore then and there that he would not rest until his name eclipsed even that of Alexander, but he had no idea that to achieve such heights, he would first have to burn the world he loved to the ground. They say that the road to power is paved with good intentions, but for Julius Caesar, it was paved with an ocean of borrowed gold and the cold, hard realization that in Rome, debt is just another form of slavery. Returning from Spain, the man who had wept at the feet of Alexander's statue was no longer a weeping boy, but a man possessed by a singular, terrifying clarity. He knew that to rule the world, he first had to own Rome. But the city was a pit of vipers, and admission cost a fortune he did not have. He set his sights on the position of Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the Roman religion, a role that offered not just spiritual authority, but the holy immunity he needed to survive his enemies. To win against two reputable senators, Caesar didn't just campaign. He bought the soul of the city, spending his personal fortune until his coffers were empty and the loan sharks were circling like sharks in bloody water. He knew that if he failed, he would be exiled, bankrupt, and finished, telling his mother on the morning of the election that he would return as Pontifex Maximus, or he would not return at all. But a title alone could not protect him from the mountain of debt he had accrued. And to keep the wolves at bay, Caesar needed allies who were more powerful than the law itself. He turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, a man whose wealth was so vast he owned half the city's debt. Crassus paid off a staggering portion of Caesar's liabilities, but money was only one leg of the stool. They needed muscle. They needed the sword. Enter General Pompey, a war hero respected and feared by the Senate, a man who had initially looked at Caesar with disdain and suspicion. In a masterstroke of political engineering that would doom the Republic, Caesar brought these two rivals together, binding them in a secret alliance known as the First Triumvirate. It was a three-headed monster designed to strangle the democracy of Rome. Crassus brought the gold, Pompey brought the legions, and Caesar brought the political cunning. To seal this pact in blood, Caesar gave his daughter Julia to Pompey in marriage, while he himself married Calpurnia, securing his flank as he ascended to the consulship in 60 BC. With the consulship secured, Caesar had the authority to command, but he knew that in Rome, political power evaporates the moment you leave office, and he needed a legacy written in blood and conquest to rival the ghost of Alexander. He needed a war. His eyes turned north, past the civilized borders of Italy, to the wild, terrifying expanse of Gaul, a land of dark forests and warrior tribes that had haunted Roman nightmares for centuries. This was not merely a military campaign. It was a treasure hunt disguised as national defense, a way to plunder enough gold to pay off Crassus and buy his own legend. In April of 58 BC, commanding 4 legions of roughly 24,000 men, Caesar marched into the unknown, stepping into a hornet's nest of tribal warfare and shifting alliances. He didn't just invade, he manipulated the chaos, presenting himself as a savior to some tribes while crushing others, exploiting their internal feuds to gain a foothold in a land that wanted him dead. The true test came quickly at the Battle of Bibracte, where the migrating Helvetii tribe threatened to overwhelm his forces with sheer numbers. The air was thick with the dust of thousands of warriors, the ground shaking under the stampede of a desperate migration. Caesar, displaying the tactical genius that would define his career, seized the high ground, hiding a portion of his legions behind a hill like a coiled snake waiting to strike. When the Helvetii surged forward, crashing against the Roman shield wall, the trap was sprung. The hidden legions slammed into the enemy rear, turning a chaotic brawl into a calculated slaughter. The discipline of the Roman machine ground the barbarian numbers into the dirt, forcing a surrender that sent thousands back to their lands as subjects and thousands more to Rome in chains, fueling the slave markets that kept the Republic running. This was the taste of blood Caesar had craved, and it was only the appetizer. Year after year, the Roman war machine chewed through the Germanic tribes and the Belgae, suffocating rebellions and burning settlements until the map of Gaul was stained Roman red. But Caesar's ambition knew no borders, not even the edge of the known world. In 55 BC, his scouts reported a mysterious island across the Channel, a place of mist and legend called Britain, known only from ancient Greek manuscripts. Driven by an insatiable need to go where no Roman had gone before, he ordered the construction of a fleet, defying the very ocean to stop him. But nature is a cruel mistress. As his ships crossed the Channel, a violent storm smashed them against the cliff rocks, shattering his transport and leaving his men stranded on a hostile beach, surrounded by Breton war chariots. It was a disaster that would have broken a lesser man. Yet Caesar stood firm on the shingle, facing the painting warriors of the north. Though he was forced to retreat that year, he returned in 54 BC with a vengeance, subduing the tribes and proving that the reach of Rome extended even beyond the sea. However, while Caesar was playing explorer in Britain, the embers of resistance in Gaul were being fanned into a roaring inferno. A charismatic and brilliant chieftain named Vercingetorix had risen, uniting the fractured tribes under a single banner, with a terrifying realization. If they did not stand together, they would die alone. Vercingetorix was not a fool. He knew he could not beat the Roman legions in open battle. So he declared a war on the land itself. He initiated a scorched earth policy, burning his own villages, torching the grain stores, and poisoning the wells, seeking to starve the Romans into submission. The strategy worked. Caesar's men began to drop from hunger, their march turning into a desperate slog through a wasteland of ash and smoke. But Caesar, ever the improviser, turned to bribery and intimidation, forcing neutral chiefs to give up their hidden stores, keeping his starving army alive just long enough to corner his prey. The final showdown took place at Alesia, a fortress city perched on a high hill, a position so defensive it seemed impregnable. Vercingetorix retreated inside, thinking he was safe, but he had merely trapped himself in a cage. Caesar arrived and did the unthinkable. Instead of attacking the walls, he built his own. He ordered his men to construct a massive wooden fortification around the entire city, a ring of death designed to starve the defenders out. But the noose tightened around Caesar's neck as well. Scouts reported that a massive Gaulish relief army was marching to rescue Vercingetorix, threatening to crush the Romans between the city walls and a fresh horde. Facing annihilation from both sides, Caesar ordered the construction of a second wall facing outward, creating a donut of fortifications where his army was trapped in the middle, fighting for their lives against two armies simultaneously. The battle that followed was the stuff of nightmares. The Gauls threw wave after wave against the wooden palisades, desperate to break the Roman line, while Vercingetorix sortied from the city to hammer the inner wall. It was a meat grinder of spears and pila, dust and screams. At the critical moment when the line began to buckle, Caesar himself donned his scarlet cloak and rode into the fray, fighting alongside his men, his presence electrifying the exhausted legions. The gamble paid off. The relief army was shattered, their morale broken against the Roman shield wall. Witnessing the destruction of his last hope, Vercingetorix rode out alone from the gates of Alesia. In a moment of haunting silence, the king of the Gauls stripped off his armor and threw it at Caesar's feet, surrendering not just a city, but the freedom of his people. Caesar had done the impossible. He had conquered Gaul, invaded Britain, and amassed a fortune that rivaled the gods. He was ready to return to Rome as a hero, but the Rome he left behind had changed. Crassus was dead, killed in a disastrous campaign in the east, and the triumvirate was broken. Pompey, now jealous and fearful of Caesar's rising star, sat alone in the Senate, sharpening his knives. The war for Gaul was over, but the war for Rome was about to begin. The conquest of Gaul should have been the end of the story, a glorious final chapter where the hero returns to bask in the adoration of the crowd. But in the shark tank of Roman politics, victory is often just a prelude to a much darker execution. While Caesar was busy expanding the map of the known world, The ground beneath his feet in Rome was crumbling, for his oldest ally had made a fatal mistake. Marcus Crassus, the man whose gold had financed Caesar's rise, marched his legions into the burning sands of the East to fight the Parthian Empire, only to be slaughtered in a disaster so absolute that it shattered the delicate balance of power that held the Republic together. With Crassus dead, the three-legged stool of the triumvirate collapsed, leaving only two titans standing on opposite sides of a widening abyss. Caesar, the populist conqueror, and Pompey, the establishment's hammer. Anepi, once Caesar's son-in-law and ally, had grown jealous of the younger man's meteoric rise, and fearful of his unchecked ambition, leading him to defect to the very Senate that wished to see Caesar dead. The Senate, emboldened by Pompey's sword, issued a decree that was less of a law and more of a death sentence. Caesar was to disband his legions, strip off his command, and return to Rome as a private citizen to face trial for his crimes in Gaul. They expected him to fold, to bow his head and accept his ruin. But they had forgotten who they were dealing with. On a cold January night in 49 BC, Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon River, a shallow stream that marked the sacred boundary between Gaul and Italy, knowing that to step across it with an army was to declare war on Rome itself. The water rushed past his boots, dark and indifferent, as he weighed the fate of the Western world in his hands. He turned to his men, his breath misting in the freezing air, and uttered the words that would echo until the end of time. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. He plunged into the river, not just crossing a geographical border, but crossing a psychological point of no return. The march to Rome was not a campaign of conquest, but a race against time, and as his veteran legions thundered south, the Senate panicked. Anepi, realizing he did not have the troops to hold the city against the man who had tamed the Gauls, fled Rome, taking the government and the aristocracy with him across the sea to Greece. When Caesar entered the Eternal City, the streets were eerily silent, devoid of the enemies he had come to fight. He was the master of Rome, but he was the master of a ghost town. The war that followed was a brutal, fratricidal nightmare that spanned the Mediterranean, a conflict where brother fought brother, and the prize was the soul of civilization. It culminated on the dusty plains of Pharsalus in Greece, where Caesar, outnumbered and starving, faced the full might of the Roman Republic under Pompey. Pompey had every advantage: more men, more cavalry, and the high ground. But he lacked the one thing Caesar possessed in abundance: the fanatical loyalty of men who had marched through hell for him. In a masterstroke of tactical genius, Caesar used a hidden line of infantry to ambush Pompey's cavalry, shattering the enemy's flank and rolling up their line like a wet carpet. As the dust settled, the great Pompey, the man who had once been called the teenage butcher, looked out over the ruin of his army and realized he was no longer the protagonist of history. Broken and terrified, Pompey fled to the one place he thought he might find sanctuary: Egypt. But the land of the pharaohs is a place where treachery blooms like lotuses in the Nile. When Pompey stepped off his boat onto the Egyptian sand, expecting a royal welcome, he was met instead by the blade of an assassin, decapitated by the advisors of the boy king Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to curry favor with the incoming victor. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit, expecting a final showdown, he was instead presented with a basket. Inside lay the severed head of Pompey the Great, preserved in brine, his eyes forever frozen in a mask of terror. The Egyptians expected Caesar to smile, to reward them for killing his rival, but instead he wept. This was not the death of an enemy. It was the desecration of a Roman consul by foreign hands, an insult to the dignity of Rome itself. Caesar's fury was a cold, terrifying thing. He stormed into the royal palace, not as a diplomat, but as a judge, and found himself in the middle of a vicious Egyptian civil war between the boy King Ptolemy and his exiled sister Cleopatra. It was here, amidst the exotic incense and the oppressive heat of the Delta, that the most famous seduction in history took place. Cleopatra, knowing she could not walk through the front door, had herself rolled up into a carpet and smuggled into Caesar's private chambers. When the rug was unfurled, revealing the young queen, Caesar saw more than just beauty. He saw a political brilliance that matched his own. They became lovers, allies, and partners in a war that would see the Nile run red with blood. During the Battle of the Nile, Caesar was nearly killed, forced to strip off his armor and swim for his life when his ship capsized. But he returned with a vengeance, drowning Ptolemy's army and placing Cleopatra on the throne. After securing the East and crushing the remaining pockets of resistance with a speed that he summarized in 3 words, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Caesar returned to Rome not as a general, but as a god walking among men. He was appointed Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, a title that stripped away the pretense of the Republic and placed absolute power in the hands of one man. He wore high red boots like the ancient kings, sat on a golden throne in the Senate, and allowed his statues to be placed among the gods. To the common people, he was a savior who passed laws to relieve debt and feed the poor. But to the old aristocracy, he was a tyrant who was suffocating the breath of liberty. The whispers in the dark corners of the Senate grew into a roar of conspiracy. Men he had pardoned, men he had promoted, men he called friends. Cassius, Casca, and most painfully, Marcus Brutus, the son of his mistress, and a man Caesar treated like his own child, began to sharpen their daggers. They convinced themselves that to save Rome, they had to kill the man who had made it the capital of the world. The date was set for the Ides of March, the 15th, in 44 BC. The omens were screaming of disaster. His wife Calpurnia dreamed of holding his murdered body and begged him not to go. And a soothsayer had famously warned him to beware this very day. But Caesar, driven by a mixture of arrogance and fatalism, walked into the Senate house of Pompey anyway. As he took his seat, the conspirators crowded around him, pretending to present a petition, cutting off his escape routes. The signal was given. A dagger flashed, burying itself in his neck. Caesar tried to fight back, twisting and grappling, but then the blades came from everywhere. 23 times steel pierced his flesh, turning his white toga into a crimson ruin. He fought like a lion until he saw Brutus, the boy he loved, stepping forward with a knife in his hand. The fight drained out of him. He pulled his toga over his head to hide his face, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him die, and collapsed at the foot of the statue of Pompey. The irony was perfect and cruel. Caesar died in the shadow of his dead rival, bleeding out on the cold marble floor while the Senate dissolved into chaos. The conspirators ran into the streets, shouting that they had killed a tyrant, expecting to be hailed as liberators, but they had miscalculated the heart of the mob. Rome did not want liberty, they wanted Caesar. His death did not save the Republic. It plunged the world into a final bloody civil war that would end with the rise of his heir, Octavian, and the birth of the Roman Empire. The man was gone, but the shadow of Caesar would stretch across history forever. The air in Rome, on the morning of March 15, 44 BC, was heavy, suffocating, and thick with an invisible tension that unsettled even the stray dogs roaming the forum. It was the Ides of March, a date that the soothsayers had explicitly warned Caesar to fear. Yet the dictator for life woke up with the arrogance of a man who believed he had strangled fate with his own hands. His wife, Calpurnia, woke screaming from a nightmare where she held his butchered body in her arms, the roof of their house collapsing in a shower of blood, and she begged him, for the first time in their marriage, to stay home. Caesar hesitated. The most powerful man in the world, the conqueror of Gaul and the master of the legions, actually considered hiding in his room because of a bad dream. But destiny has a way of dragging its victims to the altar. One of the conspirators, a man named Decimus, arrived at the house and mocked Caesar's fears, asking if the ruler of Rome would insult the Senate by refusing to attend a meeting because his wife had a nightmare. Ashamed of his own superstition, Caesar donned his purple-bordered toga and walked out the door, unknowingly stepping into his own funeral procession. On the way, someone shoved a scroll into his hand, a detailed list of the conspirators and the plot to kill him. But in the chaos of the crowd, Caesar never opened it. He held the warrant for his own salvation in his left hand, unread, all the way to the steps of the theater of Pompey. When he entered the Senate, the room did not fall silent out of respect, but out of a held breath, the kind of silence that precedes a thunderclap. He took his golden chair, surrounded by the men he had pardoned, the men he had promoted, the men he called friends. At a signal, they swarmed him. It didn't start with a speech, but with a grab at his tunic, pulling the fabric down from his shoulder, the universal sign of a brawl. Then the first dagger flashed. Casca struck him in the neck, a clumsy, nervous blow, and Caesar, shocked and roaring like a wounded lion, caught the assassin's arm, stabbing back with a stylus, fighting with the ferocity that had won him the world. But then they all descended. It was a frenzy of steel, a chaotic, graceless butchery where senators cut their own hands in their eagerness to drive their blades into his flesh. Caesar twisted and turned, looking for a friendly face, looking for help, until his eyes locked onto Marcus Brutus. This was not just a senator. This was the son of his mistress, a young man Caesar had favored, protected, and perhaps even loved as a son. Brutus stepped forward, his face a mask of conflict, and drove his dagger into Caesar's groin. The fight instantly drained out of the dictator. The betrayal severed his will to live more effectively than any blade. He did not scream a poetic final line. He simply pulled his toga over his head to hide the agony on his face, preserving his dignity even as he was hacked to pieces. He fell with a heavy, wet thud, not just anywhere, but directly at the base of the statue of Pompey the Great. The irony was so sharp, it felt written by the gods themselves. Caesar bled out on the pedestal of his dead rival. his blood soaking into the stone feet of the man he had destroyed to get there. 23 stab wounds. Only one was fatal, yet it took 23 men to kill the idea of Caesar. The senators, covered in gore, burst out of the building shouting, "Liberty! Freedom! The tyrant is dead!" expecting the people of Rome to cheer. Instead, they were met with a terrifying, hollow silence. The citizens locked their doors. The wind howled through the empty streets. The liberators had killed the man, but they had severely underestimated the ghost. They left his body lying there for hours, a heap of bloody laundry, until 3 slaves crept in to carry the master of the world home on a broken litter, one of his arms dangling lifelessly towards the dirt he once ruled. The funeral that followed was not a mourning. It was an incineration. Mark Antony, standing over the ravaged corpse of his friend, didn't just give a eulogy. He incited a riot. He unveiled Caesar's wax effigy, spinning it to show the crowd the 23 ragged holes in the toga, whipping the mob into a frenzy of grief and rage. The people of Rome, realizing their champion had been murdered by jealous aristocrats, didn't wait for a proper burial. They tore apart the benches of the Senate, the tables of the marketplace, and anything that would burn, building a massive, spontaneous funeral pyre right in the center of the forum. They cremated Caesar in the heart of the city, and from those flames the Republic didn't rise. It turned to ash. The conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, fled like rats from a burning ship, hunted across the Mediterranean not by the law, but by the vengeful armies of Mark Antony and Caesar's cold, calculated great-nephew, Octavian. Brutus, the man who killed for honor, ended his life on his own sword in the mud of Philippi, realizing too late that by killing Caesar, he had only guaranteed that someone far worse would take his place. But here is the final, chilling twist that history whispers but rarely screams. The conspirators killed Julius Caesar to prevent him from becoming a king, to stop the rule of a single man. In doing so, they set in motion the exact chain of events that destroyed the Republic forever and created the Roman Empire. They cleared the board for Octavian to rise from the ashes as Augustus, the first emperor, a ruler with far more absolute power than Caesar ever dreamed of. And while Julius Caesar the man died on that stone floor, Julius Caesar the entity achieved immortality that no god could grant. His name, Caesar, ceased to be a name and became a title. For 2,000 years, the most powerful men on earth did not call themselves kings. They called themselves Caesars. The German Kaiser is Caesar. The Russian Tsar is Caesar. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the trenches of World War I, men were still fighting and dying under the shadow of his name. He is the only man in history who was assassinated for being a tyrant, only to have the entire world spend the next 2 millennia trying to become him. In the end, Caesar didn't just conquer Gaul or Rome. He conquered time itself.